This episode is being brought to you in part by Measured Reasons, business and educational strategic planning, critical thinking, and leadership consulting since 2007. Visit www.measuredreasons.com for more information. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Time Out for Black History. We have a really good topic today, great discussion. We're going to be looking at the Georgia voting law, SB 202, and we're going to track back a little bit so we have a better understanding of why this law is so controversial. So we're going to go all the way back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And really, we're going to go back farther than that because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was put into place a year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a protection for those people who are being restricted access to voting. So some of those avenues that were being fought against were things like the grandfather clause, which stated that you had the same voting status as your grandfather. The 8-box law, which was a way to confuse voters who were illiterate. Literacy tests, poll taxes, all these different strategies that particular states used in order to minimize the votes of specific groups of people. And I'm being very generous kind of in how I'm explaining these things. So 1965 comes and Congress votes to create the Voting Rights Act that had two major stipulations in it that we're going to talk about. One of those was Section 4, which was designed to create a system that decided which states were the states or counties that were particularly guilty of denying equal access to voting. So it was kind of a formula used in order to figure out which states. And then Section 5 stated that those states would have to get federal approval on any changes they were going to make to the voting laws that had been agreed upon. Okay, and so those were set in stone in 1965. They were reestablished again, 5 years later, reestablished again 7 years later, and then reestablished for 25 years after that. So this had been a part of American society since 1965. We fast forward to 2013. And in 2013, we get a case brought to the Supreme Court, Shelby County versus Holder. Shelby County versus Holder. And it goes before the Supreme Court, and it's generally what it is. It's a challenge to the sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we get some very, very interesting decisions out of that. So in the end, they decide on a ruling of 5-4, right along ideological lines, meaning conservatives 5, liberals 4. Chief Justice Sean Roberts says, "Our country has changed. While any racial discrimination voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to the current conditions." So he's essentially arguing that we are past the days of 1965 and our country isn't like that anymore. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg argues and says, using the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that today's decision was a disservice to this country. She said the focus of the Voting Rights Act had properly changed from first-generation barriers to ballot access to second-generation barriers like racial gerrymandering and laws requiring at-large voting in places with sizable black minority. She said the law had been effective in thwarting such efforts. Okay, so that ruling decides that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. That the strategies they were using in order to determine which states or counties would be a part of this they threw out, which essentially threw out Section 5. Because almost everybody agreed, all the experts agreed, that they wouldn't be able to, as a Congress, decide which states would now fit under that. So Section 5 became moot also. Almost immediately, we saw the advent of voter identification laws and other strategies used in order to affect elections. Okay, so that brings us to SB 202, called the Election Integrity Act. Okay, this also passes along party line vote. Republicans support, Democrats against. And it's going to affect several parts of our election cycle. One of those parts being absentee voting, one of those parts being early voting, and then some other stuff, but I really want to focus on these two aspects of it. Okay, so some of the major arguments to SB 202 is that it restricts voting at every stage. And it makes it easier to restrict early voting hours, even allowing for the elimination of early voting on Sundays. And everybody knows that Black voters and other voters of color utilize Sundays' early voting hours more so than their white counterparts. It also limits where voters can cast their votes in their own counties. It shortens the runoff period, and it's an attempt to restrict voting access, which is all a part of what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was intended to protect. It also makes it harder to vote by absentee ballot, having tougher restrictions on ID requirements, making it harder for voters to receive them and return them, and moving up the deadline to request one, which will prevent some who need to vote absentee from being able to do so. SB 202 includes provisions that target and make early in-person voting by absentee ballot, and using ballot drop boxes more difficult. Instead of being accessed 24/7, there'll be hours in which you can drop your ballot into the ballot box. It also criminalizes individuals and charitable groups from providing food and water to voters as they stand in these long lines. Again, what's ironic to me about this, it's the same, literacy test. So we need this because voters need to have an understanding of, what they're voting on. 8-box law. Oh no, we just have that so that it's more organized, so people kind of know what's happening. You can always come up with excuses or explanations, but anyone with any semblance of understanding, anybody with any semblance of history, understands what these laws are for and why they're being implemented. They're being implemented at a time because Georgia lost an election in their eyes. The state level government is still heavily Republican. And so by instituting as many obstacles and barriers to make it as difficult as they possibly can for an individual to vote, they feel like that gives them a better chance. If you're an American, denying access to voting to other Americans is not American. So I challenge you to go read the rest of the bill, understand the bill, know the bill. I just gave you a great kind of background on where this bill's coming from, some of the ways in which this bill is restrictive. But this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of a fight that was had in 1865, a fight that was had in 1965, and a fight that we're about to have again against those that believe in a free democratic process and those that believe that restricting voting rights and making it more difficult to vote in order to win is an acceptable form of government. Subscribe to the channel, Time Out for Black History. Thank you for listening, and I welcome any comments in the comments section. Thank you.